This video is a reposting of a video I originally posted back on September 17, 2019. The original video entitled, "Important Political Speeches and Debates Every U.S. Citizen Should Take Note of," currently only has 58 views, 4 likes, and 0 dislikes. After recently coming across this video and watching it again, I am finding the video content to be of the utmost importance in these times we are living. And since the recent increase in my number of subscribers, I deem it necessary to publish it again. The video content will include, as taken from the original video description, will be. Each of these speeches and/or debates are important for each citizen to watch and understand since they each relay an important message or warning. President John F. Kennedy's speech on secret societies, April 27, 1961. Traficant speech, March 17, 1993. The U.S. government bankruptcy speech. The Fed tells Congressman Ron Paul that the Federal Reserve has not had any gold since 1934. European Parliament, May 21, 2013. Why the whole banking system is a scam. If I Were the Devil, remastered audio, Paul Harvey, 1964. Anthony Wiener vs. Ron Paul, the 11th of March 2004. President Lyndon Johnson talking about controlling the weather in 1963. At a conference by the Council of Foreign Relations (CFR), CIA Director John Brennan discusses geoengineering and aerosol spraying. Dwight D. Eisenhower exit speech on Jan.17, 1961, warning us of the military-industrial complex. Mind-blowing speech by Robert Welch in 1958 predicting insiders' plans to destroy America. Congress Secret Session Debate 1 of 2 on FISA. Congress Secret Session Debate 2 of 2 on FISA. Former IRS Commissioner Stephen Miller and Congressman Beccera says the income tax is voluntary. Testimony given on May 17, 2013.
Ladies and gentlemen, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program. For from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
It's time, gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, for purposes of debate only, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Traficant.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes without objection.
We are here now in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in world history, the U.S. government. We are setting forth, hopefully, a blueprint for our future. There are some that say it's a coroner's report that will lead to our demise. I'm going to support the rule. I'm not sure yet if I will support this budget. I want to hear an awful lot more, not being a member of the committee, and I'm not going to vote for things I don't understand or don't like. But let there be no mistake. After 12 years of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, we're standing here. And let me say this to the minority party. Every program Ronald Reagan wanted in 1981, he got. Reagan got it. There was a Republican Senate majority, and there were 70 Democrats in this House that might as well have been Republicans, and we have the program. And the major assumption was very simple. We're going to cut taxes, put money in the pocket of the American people, and when they spend this money, our gross national product is going to rise so great that even though we've reduced your tax liability on a percentile basis, we'll balance the budget, quoting Ronald Reagan in the fall of '82. It's going to take the fall of our Congress, I think, before that happens. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give this new administration a chance. Democrats gave Ronald Reagan a chance. But let me give one word of caution here today. America already has race wars, let's be honest about it. We already have gender wars, let's be honest about it. We already have age wars. Let's be honest about it. One thing this Congress better not get involved in and get trapped into is a class war on money. In America, if you cannot earn all that you can, there's something wrong, and there's no more a spirit of free enterprise. And I want to say this to the members. We may talk about taxing the rich, but the rich people have already taken their companies and their jobs out of America. Be careful that the rich people don't take their money out of America, because the government already raises our kids, defends our families, educates our kids, feeds our kids, houses our kids, and the government is doing a very poor job of it. I think mom and dad would be better utilized there once again. So I'm going to listen to the debate, and I don't know if I'll vote for this budget. And finally, I don't know if the budget makes one damn bit of difference, because we wave it all the time, and I don't think we've ever followed it. I think we've got an excellent chairman that worked hard, and if we're going to have a budget, we should follow it. If not, we once again as members waste both our time and the people's time. But let me say this just in closing. Today's not the mother of all debates and the mother of all decisions. When that tax package comes, you will have the mother of all votes on the floor. And let me say this. I'm not for voting any more taxes on the back of the American people, because I believe the tax of 1990 put us right here today. And I am very concerned about the tax packages being discussed in this Congress. I'm one Democrat that believes we should stimulate the private sector. We already have more government jobs than factory jobs, and I think that's an indictment on our Congress. One basic tenet of this Constitution, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and there can be no life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness in America without a job. And I'd like to see the mother of all debates center around the jobs bill. Yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I tell you, knowing that you for many years had picked up more and more support for your bill, legislation to audit the Federal Reserve, I wish truthfully, and it has nothing to do with you gentlemen here today, but I'm telling you that the distrust out here by the American people is as deep and severe as I've ever seen. And it does not only Congress itself, not only the administration, but the Federal Reserve is just at this point at a very low ebb as it relates to trust. And I'm not talking about you personally. You two men of high integrity, I know that. But right now, the Federal Reserve is not held in high esteem by many people in this country. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I have a few short questions, and then we'll finish up. The one thing is, on a follow-up on what Mr. Jones says, is the confidence is very low. But when you speak of independence, and I understand your terms, and I disagree with the need for that, but I understand it. But what people hear when you say independence, they hear secrecy. You know, you're going to keep it from us. And like the point I made at the beginning, the SEC is to pressure companies to reveal information, where the Federal Reserve does the opposite. They want, no, we can't tell anything because it might disturb the markets. But I do have one question. During the crisis, or any time that you're aware of, has the Federal Reserve or Treasury participated in any gold swaps arrangements?
We don't, the Federal Reserve does not own any gold at all. We have not owned gold since 1934. So we have not engaged in any gold swaps.
But it appears on your balance sheet that you hold gold.
What appears on our balance sheet is gold certificates. When we turned before 1934, the Federal Reserve did own gold. We turned that over by law to the Treasury and received in return for that gold certificates.
If the Treasury entered into, because under the Exchange Stabilization Fund, I would assume they probably have the legal authority to do it, they wouldn't be able to do it then because you have the securities for essentially all the gold?
No, we have no interest in the gold that is owned by the Treasury. We have simply an accounting document that is called gold certificates that represents the value at a statutory rate
and still
that we gave to the Treasury in 1930.
And still measured at $42 an ounce, which makes no sense whatsoever. But, you know, the conventional wisdom today says that gold is really not money. We don't want it to be money. I mean, if you're for the gold standard, there's something wrong with you. And yet we hold the gold. And, you know, there have been suggestions made, and I've sort of, you know, encouraged the suggestion. You know, if gold is not money and it's an asset and you don't even use it because it's on your balance sheets and you don't even use it at the real value, would you have a position on this? Why shouldn't the Treasury just sell the gold, give it back to the people? The people had it at one time. Let the people have it. Would you have any objection to that? Would you advise us and say, no, that's not good. We ought to hold the gold? Do you think holding the gold is a good idea or a bad idea?
So I have no position on that at all. That's clearly
no position.
Treasury. It's a matter for the Treasury. It's not within the purview of the Federal Reserve.
Mr. Beccera, would you have an opinion?
My opinion is I agree with Mr. Alvarez.
No position. Well, it's amazing because I've asked questions of the Federal Reserve, you know, the members of the board for years, and whether it's been Mr. Greenspan, I can't recall exactly what I've asked Mr. Bernanke, but it's always, well, no, we have to hold on to these assets. But if it's not money and we don't need it, we're not going on a gold standard, I mean, I would think that they shouldn't be holding it. The reason I ask that is the truth is gold is money, and people don't throw it away, and people do cling to it. But I would be really, there's a lot of people who suspect because of this lack of transparency that there's been a tremendous amount of gold swaps and loans made, and central banks sold a lot of gold after these the last 10 years. A lot of the gold has left the West and has gone to the East. And the central banks that now have positive trade balances, they buy up the gold. There has to be a message in there and a significance, even for those who don't want the restraints of gold. It has to be a message out there that we should look at, because we're in a financial mess. And it has to do with our monetary system, and it's being reflected today in rising prices and a weak economy. And just printing all this money isn't doing any good. All this stuff that's been done for 3 years, and you look at the economic statistics now, they're horrible. And these people who lost their jobs, they're still unemployed. The people who bought stocks in the year 2000, if they held on, they probably haven't even broken even. They probably lost purchasing power. So eventually, I know this is off the subject a little bit, but it is reflected only in that we don't know exactly what goes on. And people, when they don't know, then they get suspicious and they say, well, it's kept secret from us. Why aren't we allowed to know? And we just march on. And the type of dollars we're talking about, and when we hear about this money going to central banks and banks that Gaddafi was a part owner in, I mean, this stuff is this really stirs up the emotions of a lot of people. But I do appreciate you being here, and I know that there'll be a lot of questions. There will be written questions submitted, and we'd appreciate your cooperation and send us our answers back. And I thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
This hearing is adjourned.
For the EFT, Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the real retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
Grazie per il gruppo.
If I were the devil, if I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness, and I'd have 1/3 of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions. Just let those run wild. Until before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who wanted until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. And what'll you bet? I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work, in patriotism, in moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing. Paul Harvey,
Good day.
Mr. Speaker, there are clearly some messages to take from recent events and the bill that's on the floor today. The overriding message is that there is a responsibility that comes with being entrusted to broadcast over the public airwaves. People say that if you don't like the content of a certain show and you find it offensive, then just don't watch. The problem with that argument is that when content is being broadcast over public airwaves, it is sometimes can't be avoided. Fact is that people in this country surf and flip up and down channels of the TV and radio dial. And if we don't regulate what people can see and hear in these forums, children in particular will be exposed to material that is completely inappropriate. I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I'm convinced that the Congress has been a very poor steward of the First Amendment, and we're moving in the direction of further undermining the First Amendment. First, many years ago, it was an attack on commercial speech by dividing commercial and non-commercial speech, which the Constitution does not do. And now, once again, we are attacking indecency, which we all should, but how we do it is pretty critical. And yet, indecency obviously is a subjective term, and it'll be yet to be defined in the courts. We should remember that the Congress, very clearly by the Constitution, is instructed to make no laws abridging the freedom of speech. It can't be any clearer. So if we have problems, they're to be solved in different manners. The excuse that because the government is responsible and own the airways that we can suspend the First Amendment is incorrect. It's a good argument for privatizing the airways rather than an excuse for suspension of the First Amendment.
And that message calls for new frontiers, new vision. It calls for us taking the steps now that will make us no longer second in space and in science. It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives. Now, I could go on and on and on and on about the things that fascinate me, but rather than talk about them, I thought I'd stop here and start the conversation with Judy, and then I can take some of your questions. I very much appreciate the invitation to come back here in the Council on Foreign Relations. And as I say to all the groups I speak to, it is a tremendous honor and privilege every day to be referred to as the Director of Central Intelligence Agency. I lead an organization full of patriotic men and women who take great risks and put themselves on the front lines in order to keep their fellow Americans safe and secure, and to do what they can to keep this country's security secure. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
A part of that plan, of course, is to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty, piece by piece and step by step, to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example. Now, here are the aims for the United States. 1, greatly expanded government spending for every conceivable means of getting rid of ever larger sums of American money as wastefully as possible. 2, higher and then much higher taxes. 3, an increasingly unbalanced budget despite the higher taxes. 4, wild inflation of our currency. 5, government controls of prices, wages, and materials, supposedly to combat inflation. 6, greatly increased socialistic controls over every operation of our economy and every activity of our daily lives. This is to be accompanied naturally and automatically by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of our bureaucracy and in both the cost and reach of our domestic government. 7, far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines. There is a many-faceted drive at work to have our state lines eventually mean no more within the nation than our county lines do now within the states. 8, the steady advance of federal aid to and control over our educational system, leading to complete federalization of our public education. 9, a constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of modern warfare, the beauties and the absolute necessity of peace, peace always on communist terms, of course. And 10, the consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by our government which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world and of the United States itself. So brush the insider's dust out of your eyes, my friends, and the communist soap suds out of your brain, and ask yourselves in all honesty, what on earth is wrong with the United States simply minding its own business? Or with having its foreign policy function primarily for the safety and benefit of the American people. Which is exactly what we had done for the first 140 years of our existence as a nation, to the incredible advantage of ourselves and everybody else. Everybody, that is, except a numerically small clique of power-lusting conspirators who had somehow inflicted themselves on a gullible world. While we turn to a very brief summarization of what we hope the John Birch Society will help and even sometimes lead the American people to accomplish during the next 15 years. 1, our first and most important specific undertaking should be to restore the complete independence of the United States. This includes our resolution to get us out of the United Nations and get the United Nations out of the United States. 2, we must once again make our money freely redeemable in gold at some realistic price. And we must take all practicable legislative steps to prevent a recurrence of the enormous thievery and other subversive crimes that have been perpetrated on the American people through a contrived inflation by every president from Franklin Roosevelt through Richard Nixon. 3, we should reduce the number of government bureaus, of government civilian employees, and the whole quantity of government by at least 50%. And we should achieve at least this much reduction in proper fashion through gradually convincing a majority of the American people of the wisdom of such a course. 4, we should withdraw all American troops from every spot on earth that is not American soil, except when and where such troops may be required as decided by Congress to protect American lives and property from criminal vandalism. 5, we should get government out of the areas and functions and activities where government does not belong. Again, all steps to this end should be taken gradually. but nevertheless just as rapidly as enough of the American people can be persuaded to support such progress. Any such achievement will require a truly massive educational force, but that's exactly what we hope to build during the next 15 years. We could go ahead for at least 100 numbered items, but the John Birch Society will undoubtedly be working on more than that many specific projects, which will be laid out in its bulletins before another 180 months will have rolled around. And all of them will fit into, all of these projects will fit into the general pattern indicated by the 5 major objectives listed above. So let's really wind up this marathon monologue with one final thought. None of us can guarantee anything about what the future will bring. Your speaker knows what a job we have before us to rid our country of the scourge of communism within the next few years, and then to go ahead on our constructive program so well that 15 years from now we shall already be entering an era of far less government, of a much sounder sense of responsibility, and, with God's help, of a better world. But I sincerely believe that it can be done, and this much I know. If every man and woman in this audience should leave here tonight feeling in his or her own mind and heart that it can and must be done, then it surely will be. And so, all of you patriots of good character, good conscience, and noble ideals, whom we can reach with the filmed version of this speech in 1,000 other audiences, it is with a great deal of confidence and energizing will to win that we invite you to join us in our epic undertaking. To all of you great, wonderful friends in this present audience, I certainly extend my very deep thanks indeed for so much patience and attention. Thank you.
Once again, looking live at the U.S. Capitol at this hour here in Washington. A security sweep on the floor of the U.S. House. We're told maybe 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock Eastern Time is the starting point for that secret session. We don't expect to see the House of Representatives back in public tonight. They'll be back tomorrow morning at 10 and continue their public debate on the FISA legislation. Earlier this evening, about 6 o'clock Eastern Time, there was some debate on the floor talking about this secret session, this closed session. Here's some of what led up to where we are now.
Madam Speaker, at the request of and after discussion with the distinguished Republican whip, I ask unanimous consent that at a time designated by the Speaker on the legislative day of March 13, 2008, the House resolve itself into secret session as though pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 17. Secondly, debate in such secret session proceed without intervening motion for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the majority leader and the minority whip. And thirdly, at the conclusion of that debate, the secret session shall be dissolved.
Reserving the right to object, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to, the leader, I believe I heard you say Clause 8. Did you mean Clause 9?
Clause 9.
Clause 9, and this secret session would be convened at some time by the Speaker today when the room has been secured and would dissolve at the end of an hour of discussion. Is that the way I understand the?
That's what the consent agreement contemplates. Pursuant to our discussions.
Continue his point of reservation.
I think I can withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman withdraws his point.
Reserving the right to object.
We'll get notice on.
Gentleman for Ohio.
Would the gentleman from Maryland yield to question?
Certainly. No. But you may want to stay.
Can you divulge to this House what is going to be discussed? Not the content of it, but the topic that's going to be discussed.
My presumption is, and I think that's accurate because of my discussions with the Republican whip, and the discussion will be with reference to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
And is it the debate that will take place regarding the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act what would conceivably be the nature of that debate?
I can't tell you that because I don't know.
But there's going to be debate. Is it going to be debate over legislation?
I presume, I tell the gentleman from Ohio, that it certainly will relate to the legislation that we'll be then considering probably at this point in time tomorrow.
Does the gentleman in his long experience in the House, could he communicate to those who have, in my case, been in this House 12 years or less, any time in your experience where the House has debated legislation in secret?
My presumption is that we will not debate the legislation in secret. Not only is that my presumption, I think we clearly will have public debate tomorrow on the bill. The minority whip came to me indicating that there were things that he thought the members ought to have knowledge of that he was of the opinion could not be divulged in public debate. There is a provision under our rules to accomplish that objective. After discussion with him and limitation on the time, so that we could in fact get to a vote on what we believe is very important legislation, we have agreed to this arrangement. Again, it's limited, but we did not want to be, nor are we in the position of saying to the minority whip, if he has such information, that we want to preclude that from being offered, because we want no indication that any information is being withheld. That is appropriate, obviously. There are going to be restrictions, obviously, even in the context of the session.
My friend has said two things. One is that there's an assumption that it's going to be about FISA, and another one is that there is going to be a debate of sorts. When I asked the question, if you are aware of whether or not anything like this has happened before, with respect to, we're talking about specific legislation that is before this House, whether or not anyone, would the gentleman know, what is the precedent for this? Is this unprecedented that the House of Representatives would be meeting in secret preliminary to legislation that it intends to pass? I haven't experienced this in my time, and for information purposes, I would ask the gentleman who's been here, I think, 26, 28 years, if in his experience he can remember that.
I thank the gentleman. In responding to him, I believe, and I'm not frankly absolutely positive, and I'm hoping that somebody, perhaps on the Intelligence Committee staff or others on the House, well, can I make an observation? I believe that during the early 80s or middle 80s, with reference to the 1983 on Contragate, there was such
19 when?
83.
On what?
Contragate. As you know.
Iran-Contra?
Yes.
Was that before the hearings or after the hearings?
I don't know the answer to that question. If Mr. Blunt,
well, I mean, there's relevance there.
If you'll yield to Mr. Blunt, he may be able to offer
my friend,
Mr. Blunt.
My friend, I didn't quite hear your last question. Was it before or after what?
Yeah, I asked, it said it was on Iran-Contra, that there was a...
It was not on Iran-Contra. It was 1983, and it was on Contra. In fact, our colleague from Florida, Mr. Young, called for that secret session in 1983. There was also a secret session in 1979 and in 1980. So there have been three of these. They were in recent years, but it has obviously been a long time since 1983.
And they were preliminary to the passing of legislation.
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I just want to point out something here as this House proceeds on this track. There are some of us here who feel that this country has drifted towards a version of a national security state. When the House begins to meet in secret on matters that relate to security prior to legislative acts, it raises questions about the Constitution of the United States. I know I'm familiar with my friend's awareness that the Constitution gives the Congress the ability to make its own rules. I also understand from the First Amendment that Congress wouldn't restrict any establishment of free speech. This is the citadel of free speech. This is the only place in America that someone can stand and say anything they want at any time and be free from any kind of illegal attack. Once we close that up, we're changing the nature of it at a time when this country's at war, when there's been questions raised about secret meetings and what was told with respect to torture, about secret meetings and what was told with respect to rendition, about secret meetings and what was told with respect to private corporations doing wiretapping. I just want the members of this House to incorporate that in their reflections when we proceed to approve an agreement for a secret meeting. I'd also like to state this, to just share my experience, and that is without referring to any content of any secret meeting I've been in, and I've been in a few at the beginning of my term in the House. I have found from my own experience, that secret meetings end up being occasions for the communication of information of at least, at best, dubious value. And I'm not in any way impugning the motives of my good friends who are asking for a secret meeting in this case. But I'm sharing with you my experience prior to this moment, that secret meetings have been the occasion to communicate information that hasn't particularly been forthright or true. Now, you know, and I could point to individuals, at least one individual who's sitting in this chamber right now, who when we had a secret meeting right after 9/11, walked right down that aisle and, you know, uttered a famous barnyard expletive after we were being briefed in a secret meeting by a member of the administration. Some of you were there at the time to remember. So I'm just communicating a concern here about the path we're going down. And, you know, I can only do that. I am going to, I will not attend that meeting. I will withdraw my objections, but I want to have my friends here know that we ought to be proceeding with the utmost caution in going into this direction.
The gentleman withdraws his objection. Is there objection?
I am not going to be attending such a session. I believe that it violates the spirit of this House, but I will withdraw my objection since my good friend feels that this is the path that he has to go.
Thank you.
Madam. Is there further objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The gentleman from Arizona.
Would the leader yield for 2 questions?
Yes.
As I understand the situation, we're going to secure the chambers, and in securing the chambers, it would mean, I think it means that from the cloakroom, the people who work the cloakroom, who usually tell us when the chamber will be cleared, how are they going to communicate that we can come back in for the secret session? Come back in for the secret session.
Yeah. Well, the answer to the question is you will all be receiving from the leader and the whip's office on your emails notification of the time, and you will get sufficient notice. It is contingent upon how long it takes those to that have the responsibility to do so. But you will be getting on your emails in a time frame that will allow you to get back notice.
The second question I have, if you yield.
Yes.
Do you expect to have further votes tonight for those of us who will not attend the secret session, and we won't know when it's finished?
If this is approved, my expectation is there probably will be no further votes tonight.
I remove the objection and thank the gentleman.
The gentleman withdraws his objection. Is there further objection?
Reserving the right to object. Certainly, if the minority leader or any other member of this House has classified information about a sensitive and important subject like foreign intelligence, and there's no other way to present it, this is an appropriate way to do it. I want to be sure that I understand the parameters under which that's being done. It is occurring pursuant to to a unanimous consent agreement that sets forth the conditions of this meeting.
Yes.
And isn't the minority leader has mentioned that there were secret sessions of this House in 1979, and 1980, and 1983, and apparently there has not been one since 1983?
I think that's accurate.
To the best of your knowledge. I address it to anyone.
That's the best of my knowledge. I'm the minority whip. I'm sure the leader would verify that as well. And we have members here who were here during that time. But there has not been a secret session since 1983. There have clearly been times when the room has been secured, but not for a secret session. And that's
so. And in the history of the United States Congress, since its founding, there have been secret sessions no more than 5 times.
That's not correct. I think
do you have an estimate of it?
I think the early days they were in secret session all the time, or much of the time, and 3 times since 1825. I think there have been 3 secret sessions. Prior to that, I think there were many secret sessions.
So since 1825, 3 times in the history of this country. And at no time since 1983 we have done what you are proposing this unanimous consent agreement to do. Now, in this session, so that I understand the parameters and assure that we're not really doing the public's business in secret that ought to be done out here in public, will the session and the debate be limited to the presentation of classified material or the discussion of the significance of that classified material?
That's my expectation.
No.
Yield to it.
No. If we move this without unanimous consent of the rules, it provides for an hour of debate, and you can debate and discuss the information that's presented and the conclusions that may have been drawn from that information. Could I yield for the gentleman?
Let me just get clarification of that.
I don't have the time.
I'm just trying to be, I would not want to limit the ability of anyone to debate any aspect of this. If their points are clear and justified, I would want them to do that in front of the American people and not in a secret session, unless it in some way compromised the confidentiality and the classified nature of the material. And that's what I'm trying to be sure, that if I come tonight, as I intend to do to this session, and I hear an hour or 15 or 20 minutes of debate that has nothing to do with these classified materials, I want to know if I'm going to have the right to raise a point of order that this is conducting the public's business in secret and that we have been brought here under false pretenses. I assume that won't happen, but I want to be clear before going into this session what my rights are pursuant to the unanimous consent agreement, because if the unanimous consent agreement does not protect that, then it would be appropriate, I suppose, at this time to ask that the agreement be amended to provide something along those lines.
I think the answer is within the framework of the unanimous consent I've requested. There is not such a limitation. I think the gentleman is correct on that. However, as I said, my expectation in my discussions with the whip is that the purpose of the session is to offer information that might not otherwise be appropriate to disclose in public session. My expectation is there's going to be a fulsome debate, as there has been, tomorrow on the legislation itself. So my expectation, given the shortness of the time that we're talking about, 30 minutes per side, we will have the Intelligence Committee here and the Judiciary Committee here to comment. Obviously, it's going to be a little difficult because if there's information brought up that there may be comment on that information, and very frankly, the parameters of the debate tomorrow may, although not disclosing that information, may obviously be perceived by many of us as relating to whatever is discussed. It's very difficult to know specifically because I do not know the specific information that is going to be, that the request was made for.
I understand. If there is discussion and debate of matters that do not concern classified materials, then under the terms of the unanimous consent agreement and the rules of the House, is any member of this House who's present for that discussion free to openly discuss in public during latter debate what was said during that session?
I think that's a very good question. Let me tell you that we have asked, Mr. Blunt and I have discussed that, we've asked the appropriate officials, not partisan officials, of this House, under the rules, to give us the answer to that question and to have on paper the specific advice to every member of the House, so that we cannot have members go out of here, put themselves at risk of violation of the rules, have clear advice and counsel as to what that is. Now, it is my belief, this is not an opinion given to me, but it is my belief that every member of this House that receives information from sources unrelated to this hour are certainly free, as they are right now, to discuss that information. And the fact that it is discussed in the session would not adversely affect that right. It certainly, I would be shocked and not in agreement with this unanimous consent if the case were otherwise.
Would the gentleman yield?
I believe I control the time under the reservation, but I yield to you.
Gentleman from Texas controls the time.
I was here for the last 3 secret sessions we have. They are unusual, but it is within the rules, and that did deal with subject matter dealing with legislation that we were to talk about. We should be careful, however, while some classified information might be discussed, the information that those of us on the Judiciary Committee and Intelligence Committee received of the program we were read into, we are not able to discuss what we were briefed on specifically. We are, as I understand under the rules, able to draw conclusions and attempt to present that based on what we saw. But the fact that we have a secret session does not allow us to speak to that. Secondly, that which is discussed in the secret session cannot be revealed even if it is of a non-classified nature. It does not prohibit you in the later debate on the floor from discussing the same subject, saying the same thing. It is that you cannot refer to it having been in the secret session. And I hope that helps the gentleman.
You were saying you were here in 1979, 1980, and 1983 for those 3 sessions.
Believe it or not, I was, as young as I am now.
Yes. You know, we're not surprised by that.
Well, I would just suggest that we would be better off having this done in the unanimous consent agreement itself, since that is what's setting out the terms of this discussion. It is a very, very serious matter when we do the public's business in secret. That's why it's only been done 3 times since 1825. And it is a very bad precedent for this House to get into the business of conducting any of its business in secret, except, and Mr. Blunt appears to provide the exception, except, just concluding on that, and then of course, except under a circumstance where there's classified material on something as important as the security of our families, and so long as we have set out all the parameters of the meeting in the agreement, then I have no problem with it. But I don't want it to wander off in debate, which now my friend tells me I can't talk about afterwards because I came to this secret session about something that maybe didn't need to be secret.
Well, my friend,
I yield.
The contemplation of this unanimous consent is that there will be no business done in the sense of doing business is taking legislative action. That nobody contemplates.
When the liberal group got a exempt status, and 3 that I just mentioned didn't for over 2 years. Mr. Nunes mentioned Ms. Lerner. Who was her boss in 2011 and 2012? Who did she report to?
I believe it would have been
Sarah Ingram, maybe?
Part of that time, and part of that time another gentleman.
Okay. And that other gentleman has since submitted his resignation?
I believe so.
And what is Ms. Ingram doing today? What's her job title?
She works on on implementing the Affordable Care Act.
Okay. Who promoted her to that position?
I would have moved her into that position.
Why would you promote somebody to that position who was in charge of the exempt organization division, which certainly has had some controversy over the last couple years, under an investigation?
Because she is a superb civil servant, sir.
So she had nothing to do with this?
I wouldn't imagine so.
Even
By the
though
way, I can't speak to individual cases. I can say generally, we provided horrible customer service here. I will admit that. We did. Horrible customer service.
You
Whether it was
targeted
politically
an individual.
motivated or not is a very different question.
You targeted an individual, an American, who
All right.
still doesn't know to this day why he was question number 26.
All right, time has expired. Mr. Beccera is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your testimony. And let me key off of something, Mr. Miller, you said. You said foolish mistakes were made. I think the President actually said it better. He said that the handling of those tax-exempt applications in that process at the IRS was outrageous and intolerable. No excuse. And as much as we know that the folks at IRS have a thankless job because they have to go and tell their fellow Americans that they may be audited or they have to do this work understaffed, we have to maintain the confidence in the system because it's a voluntary system of payment of our taxes.
Agreed.
And so you are right. It was a foolish mistake, but the President's even more correct that it was outrageous and intolerable. Now, let me also focus on something, Mr. George, you said. When you were asked, was there any finding or evidence of political motivation here, you said no.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And so what we find is a situation where inexcusable activity took place because it erodes the confidence of the American people in a system where they participate voluntarily. And if there's a place in public service where you have to have the highest level of conduct and standards, it's at the IRS. And so, Mr. Miller, I think it's unfortunate for those who are in positions of authority, but the buck has to stop somewhere, and I think that's exactly what we're saying. That should not diminish the good work that has been done by anyone within the IRS over the years. And so I hope you understand that you are here today talking to us because we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to clean up and clear out so we can go back to the business of making sure that people respect the fact that we have a voluntary system of paying our taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, I want to talk a little about the culture of the organization. As looking at the note, your bio, 90,000 employees, $12 billion budget. You've been there 25 years. I'm concerned, and I guess to start off, we've got a mission statement there. I'm very concerned about the breadth and the depth of maybe what's going on. I think a lot of employees probably do a good job, but I've been a person that's been in business 30 years and run larger organizations. So you've got a mission statement in terms of talking about working for the American people, doing what's right, playing by the rules. Is that something that's internalized at the IRS, or is that just something on a website?
So I believe, Congressman, it's internalized, and the vast majority of our folk are hardworking, incredibly honest people. I'm going to tell you, and you guys should hear that as these discussions occur, it's damaging to the morale of those people. It's probably ultimately damaging to the sense of voluntary compliance, which underlies our entire tax system. And
Well, let me just say, I think there's probably a lot of good people, but at the same time, we've got a massive PR problem at minimum.
We do.
And this has got to be dealt with quickly, and it can't just drag on for 6 months to a year. So I think we need to get to the bottom of it. The other thing, let me just ask, in terms of that size organization, who's in charge? who's the boss? How is that hierarchy? How does it work? You know, I ran a very decentralized business where I had a corporate structure, but I had managers and partners in different operations. How is the IRS, you know, in terms of being an acting commissioner? You've been there 25 years. Who do you report to, or the commissioner ideally in the past, who do they report to? And at what point, when something like this comes up, who's involved at the next level up?
So the reporting chain and the organization is, there are 2 deputies and reporting to the commissioner, and the commissioner reports to the deputy secretary of Treasury.
Who's ultimately responsible?
The commissioner or acting commissioner, not the Treasury. The Treasury relationship is such that they would not be involved.
So who would be responsible for you? Who basically asked you to resign or fired you?
It would be Secretary Lew.
Secretary Treasurer. The other thing is, let me ask you, there's been 2 people that have been, were you terminated or fired? What happened there? Or are you getting ready to retire?
I was asked to resign, and I will retire.
Okay.
As under the civil service rules.
Now, on what basis do you feel like you're getting asked, and maybe one other person, I guess, got asked, but it seems like there's a lot of other people, ideally in Cincinnati and Washington and other parts, that haven't been held accountable?
I'm not sure what the question is, sir. If I could answer it and then tell me if I'm answering the wrong question.
Okay, go ahead.
We're not done yet. We're not. We now have the Treasury Inspector General's report. We now have the sense of the facts. Now is the time for those that remain, including the incoming acting commissioner, Mr. Werfel, to take those actions.
Let me mention, as it's been brought up with a couple of the ladies that work with you, Lois Lehner and Sarah Ingram, what's being done about those 2? Because they've been in the press. There's a lot of concern about that. They ran a large operation, and it seems to be at the heart of the issues today. I think that's got to get dealt with in a very aggressive, clear way in the next week or 2.
I don't know whether it will be or not. That will be up to the new acting commissioner.